All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the final installment of our Arizona Biography Series, The Stuff of Legends. I am your host today. I am Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Coordinator for the Arizona Historical Society. I'm also an Associate Editor of the Journal of Arizona History, and we are really happy to have you with us today. A little bit about AHS before we get started. The Arizona Historical Society is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution, and we're a state agency, and we were established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the story of Arizonans past through museum exhibitions, library and archives, collections, outreach, educational programs, and publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. Stay connected with us here at the Arizona Historical Society. Consider becoming a member of the Historical Society. Among the many, many perks of membership at AHS, members do get a print copy of the Journal of Arizona History when it comes out quarterly. Sign up for our email list, follow us on social media, explore one of our museums, and you can learn all that and more by visiting us at azhs.org today. Some helpful reminders for today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, so John and I cannot hear or see you. So if you have questions, please use either the chat feature or the Q&A feature. We will get to your questions at the end of the session. Note that this event is recorded, and I will send a link to the recording to all participants, hopefully by the middle of next week. Sometimes it takes me a little bit longer to do it. And we will also post it on our YouTube channel, and we hope that you'll share it with someone who will find it especially interesting. And then again, if you enjoy this program, consider becoming a member. Membership directly supports programming initiatives like this at the Arizona Historical Society. All right, last but not least, the moment we've all been waiting for, I would like to introduce our speaker today, John Boessenecker. John, since 1968, has published scores of magazine articles about violence on the frontier. He is the award-winning author of 12 books, including the New York Times best-selling Texas Ranger, The Epic Life of Frank Hammer, the Man Who Killed Bonnie and Clyde. In 2011, 2013, and 2018, True West magazine named him their best nonfiction writer. He received a Spur Award from the Western Writers of America, the Best Book Award from the Westerners International, and an International Latino Book Award. He has appeared frequently as a historical commentator on PBS, the History Channel, A&E, and other media. And his latest book, The Gentleman Bandit, The True Story of Black Bart and the Old West's Most Infamous, is The Gentleman Bandit, The True Story of Black Bart, the Old West's Most Infamous Stagecoach Robber. Thank you so much for being with us today, John.
Thanks so much for having me. Are you ready for me to start, or I think you had some images you were going to show, or is that?
No, I think we're all ready to go.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about my new book, or not new, it came out a few years ago. I'll hold it up here. It's called Wildcat, and it's the true story of Pearl Hart, who's the most famous woman outlaw of the Old West. And if you watch television, film, you'd probably believe that Western women outlaws were very common, that there were many cowgirls in the Old West, that they wore skin-tight blue jeans and they carried six-shooters around their waists. And if you see the more recent film, 1884, they wear a tank top in 1884. And these are all creations of Hollywood. They give a kind of a fictitious image of what it was like for women in the Old West. Because in the 19th century, a woman's role was domestic. Women were at home, they raised children, they managed the family. Sometimes they'd help their fathers and husbands in the fields in rural communities. And women that had no education or no other job opportunities in life often resorted to a life of prostitution, not so much different than today. But those were the actual historic roles of women in the Old West. There were some women outlaws. One of them was not Belle Starr. Belle Starr today, she's known as the Bandit Queen of Oklahoma. She's the most famous woman outlaw. Belle Starr wasn't a bandit. She never robbed anybody. She sold liquor to the Indians, I think once, and she was a consort of outlaws, but she certainly was not a bandit. The same thing is true of a number of women of the Old West. Madame Mustache, a very famous woman in the Old West. She was a gambler. The Calamity Jane is also a very well-known person. She claimed to be a US Army scout, but in fact, she was a prostitute, what they called a camp follower. She would follow the soldiers' encampments around the Dakota and Montana, Wyoming territories as a prostitute. And she lived later in life and told all kinds of cockamamie stories about her life. The difference between them and the actual women that did commit crimes in the Old West is a fairly vast one. There was another woman stage robber in the Old West. Her name was Lizzie Keith. She and her she was very young, in her late teens, and her fiance, they ran out of money in the early 1870s, and they held up and robbed a stagecoach in what is now San Benito County, at that time part of Monterey County. And she was promptly captured. Her male partner was sent to San Quentin. And in that era, a woman had to do something pretty awful to end up in prison. Murder or some kind of serious robbery, because women were so underrepresented. In early California, for example, in the early parts of the gold rush, California was 90% male. By 1860, it was still, I think, more than 80% male. Arizona Territory, very similar. Women were a small minority, so they were treated differently. Juries, and as we'll see, had a tough time convicting women of anything unless it was a serious murder or other serious offense, and the evidence against them was clear. So in this case, Lizzie Keith was released, even though she was equally guilty of stage robbery, and her partner went to San Quentin. Another famous, or more recently famous woman stage robber is Jane Kirkham of Colorado. But the fact is, she's entirely fictitious. She never existed. I never even heard of her till about 5 years ago. There's all kinds of things on the internet, total fabrication. Pearl Hart was the real deal. In 1899, stagecoach robberies are very, very common. Another myth is that this was the last stagecoach robbery of the Old West. The first stagecoach robbery of the Old West happened about 1855 in California. The last robbery of a horse-drawn stage in the American West took place in northern Nevada in 1916. So this robbery that I'm about to describe was a very humdrum affair. My most recent book about Black Bart, he robbed 33 stagecoaches, never shot anybody. He was what they called a gentleman bandit. And so these stage robberies were fairly common. And in Arizona Territory, they were common. In 1899, a stagecoach is rattling down this very rough mountain trail. It doesn't exist anymore. And it went down from Globe, the famous mining camp, to Florence, Arizona. And about halfway through is a place called Cane Springs Canyon, which you can really only get to by hiking and on foot today. There is remnants of the old stagecoach trail are still there, but it's very, very isolated. And the stagecoach is going through Cane Springs Canyon. Suddenly, two masked robbers come out. They stop the stage. Contrary to Western films, many, many stagecoaches were not the Concord coach that you see in films like Stagecoach. Those are the fancy, expensive stagecoaches. Many stage lines in the West couldn't afford those. And they used what were called mud wagons. And these were sort of primitive wagons outfitted to carry people, made by local wagon makers. And the wagon, that stage wagon or the stagecoach that was stopped in Cane Springs Canyon, looked more like a buggy, something with 4 to 6 seats and a driver and a canvas top, without, a wood top with a shotgun messenger on top of it. This was a passenger stagecoach with no Wells Fargo messenger aboard. And so the robbery itself was fairly standard. The 2 robbers took cash from the passengers and the driver, rifled their pockets, took their pistols away. And the passengers, though, recognized that one of them seemed somewhat effeminate. And a couple of the passengers thought she might be a woman. And actually, one of the passengers later, in the indictment that was later handed out, identified one of them as Little Pearl. And I'll talk about that in a bit. So these robbers then waved the stagecoach on. The whole robbery took maybe 10 or 15 minutes at the most. Then they mounted their horses and disappeared. Well, the thing about Arizona Territory was it had a long history of highly capable lawmen. The Wyatt Earp and his brothers are the most famous. Bob Paul, the close friend of Wyatt Earp, one of the most famous, or one of the greatest outlaws, one of the greatest outlaw hunters of the Old West, and the guy that hired the Earp brothers as shotgun messengers for Wells Fargo. He was sheriff of Pima County, Tucson, and later became United States Marshal of Arizona Territory. And he's died still in harness as undersheriff of Pima County. So his law enforcement career lasted from the early 1850s, during the height of the California gold rush, until just after the turn of the century. And guys like this set a standard in Arizona Territory for standing off lynch mobs. So lynchings in Arizona Territory were far less common than they were in Texas or in California. They set standards for manhunting. And so it's not too much of a surprise that a very capable posse, which included a Latino ranchero who'd actually been in a big gunfight with an outlaw gang a number of years before, they get on the trail of these 2 robbers, and I'll make the story fairly brief. They catch them, 3 or 4 or 5 miles north of Benson, which at that time was a major railhead on the Southern Pacific Railroad. And so they were trying to reach the railroad to escape, and they never made it. And there's a lot of details I'm leaving out, but they capture the robbers, who turn out to be a woman who calls herself Pearl Hart, and a man, her partner, who calls himself Joe Boot. And what happens is, within a day, the story hits the newspaper wire services, and it's published all over the country. This is unheard of. Nobody's ever heard of Lizzie Keith in this obscure stage robbery that happened like 25 years before. There was a woman bank robber named Cora Hubbard who robbed a bank with a bunch of men in the 1890s. Even that didn't get anywhere near the attention of Pearl Hart robbing a stagecoach, because stagecoach robbery is this iconic crime. It did happen in other parts of the country, but iconic to the Old West. And this story just hits the wire services, and the newspapers first in Arizona. The headlines read, among many others, "We have a woman bandit." Another one, "Girl stage robber caught." Yet another, "Pretty and petite, but full of nerve." And another, "A beauty, but a bandit." And finally, I guess inevitably, "A highway woman." And so reporters flock to interview Pearl Hart in jail. And she's like very open, supposedly, about her career. She admits robbing the stage. She even gives what's now a really iconic interview to Cosmopolitan magazine, which was fairly new in 1899, but it was then and remained, I believe, to this day, one of the most popular magazines for women in the country. And they take photographs of her. Bob Paul, who I mentioned, is the undersheriff at this point in Tucson. And he's got young daughters about the same age as she is, in her mid to late 20s. And he's very sympathetic because he's used to dealing with Curly Bill Brocious and train robbers and outlaws, not this pretty young girl, and all she did was rob a stagecoach, right? So he lets the reporters into the jail. He lets them give her empty, unloaded guns and pistols, and she poses for all these famous photographs, many of which are published in Cosmopolitan. And this just creates a sensation around Pearl Hart. And she, these reporters, I'm going to read a little bit of their, excuse me, the descriptions of her. If I can find it here, the reporters describe her as this very attractive young woman. She's well-spoken. She's clearly the leader of the two. She openly admits planning the robbery. She criticizes the men and says, why do men carry pistols if they're going to give them up so easily? They didn't even try to defend themselves. They didn't try to defend the stagecoach. So she's very sarcastic. She's very funny and personable and boastful all at the same time. And so these reporters are just, entranced with this young woman. And these stories keep coming out of Florence and then out of Tucson, where she's eventually locked up awaiting trial, because the facilities in Florence, they don't have any facility for a woman prisoner, but in the courthouse in Tucson, right next to the county jail, they have a cell for women that's been set up. It's more like a little, like a comfortable room with a sofa and for visitors to come in, and it's got a bed and a sink and all that stuff. And so she's put into this jail. And the stage robbery, the story just becomes more and more well known because she's not in this jail very long before she seduces the trustee, who's the trusted prisoner who cleans the jail and does all the chores around the jail. So what he does is he cuts a hole through the wall of the room she's locked into. They escape into the night. They jump a freight train. They end up in Deming, New Mexico. And there's this huge manhunt. Again, this is headlines all over the country. And so a famous lawman from El Paso named George Scarborough, and those of you who are Western history buffs know who John Wesley Hardin is. Hardin was the most famous gunfighter of the Old West. He bragged that he killed 44 men. He actually killed about half that, I believe. But in any event, he's killed in a gunfight in El Paso. Then the guy that kills him is then killed by George Scarborough in another gunfight. El Paso was the king, the gunfighters' town back then. And so George Scarborough is famous as the man who killed John Wesley Hardin. And the short version, again, is that it doesn't take Scarborough very long to track down Pearl Hart and Joe Boot. He catches them in a room in a brothel in Deming, New Mexico, brings them back to Tucson. And Pearl Hart is taken back to Florence, and she's tried for stage robbery. And she, flirts with the all-male jury. She tells a newspaper reporter, "I refuse to be tried under a law that neither me nor my sex had any role in making." So she's held out today by some historians as an early day suffragette, an early day activist for women's rights. Excuse me. But I think her real motive is just more her kind of sarcastic and defiant sense of humor. She, as we'll find out, she had a very tough life coming along before she ended up in Arizona Territory. So this jury is entranced with this beautiful young woman. 12 men, of course. Women weren't allowed to serve on juries in most Western states until after World War I, rather. So they acquit her, and the judge is enraged because Joe Boot, he's already been acquitted and sentenced to like 20-something years in Yuma Prison, the notorious Arizona Territorial Prison. So the judge then impanels a new jury and orders the prosecutor to bring a case against Pearl Hart for stealing the pistol from the stagecoach driver. This jury, who gets read the riot act by the judge, finds her guilty. And of course, as I mentioned before, there's a double standard. She gets 5 years as opposed to Joe Boot's 20 or 25 years that he was sentenced to. And then she ends up in Yuma Prison. So the question is, and this story became very famous, all kinds of stories are told about Pearl Hart. Who was she? I'll read you just some of the names that came out then and since. All these names are surely the true name of Pearl Hart, right? Mrs. Frank Hart, Pearl Bandman, Caroline Hartwell, Pearl Taylor, Mrs. E.P. Keel, Mrs. Earl Lighthawk, and Pearl Bywater. And it's true that a couple of these names actually had a connection with Pearl Hart, but her real name was Lily Naomi Davy. And later, if anybody wants to know, I'm happy to explain how I figured this out. It was very time consuming and the story's kind of funny. But in any event, it's funny about my over research is probably the best way to term it. So she's born in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada, which is a small rural town, a logging town in the Canadian North Woods, born in 1871. And she's one of 9 children born to Albert Davy and her mother, Anna Duval. So the family is a mix, as is so common in Canada. The father is English, the mother is French, from French heritage. And this family, the father, her Lily, or Pearl, as I'll probably call her, the father is what Lily said was a brutal wretch, and worthless wretch are the terms that she used to describe her father. And I don't want to get too graphic here. You can read the details in my book. But when Lily was 11 years old, her father was a notorious drunk. He was arrested various times for fighting. The Lindsay jail still has the jail register with his name in there, arrested for drunk in public and assault and that kind of thing. But far more seriously, in the early 1880s, when Lily is 11, her father attempts to rape a 14-year-old girl in a field north of Lindsay. The girl is out picking flowers. Her father is nearby working in the fields, and her dog, who's a big ferocious guard dog, is nearby, and the dog hears her screaming for help. And this is right out of the newspapers and court records. The dog comes racing out of the brush, lunges into Albert Davy, just savagely lacerates his limbs, and Davy flees for his life. And it's something like you might read on the Animal Channel or something like that, but it actually happened. And he gets arrested by the Canadian authorities, constables that they had at that time, probably still do. And the prison term, he's very short, 2 years for a forcible attempted rape, plus 12 lashes with a cat o' nine tails on the bare back, which is part of the punishment under the Canadian criminal justice system back then. So this is her background. Later, there's much more domestic violence. He's clearly, from my analysis, molested his daughters. They all become sexualized by the time they're in their early teens. He brutally beats his wife. Finally, she takes the children and flees about 70 miles to the east to a small village in Ontario and gets a little house that's basically a ramshackle shack, the way it's described. And by this time, Lily and her older sister, Sophronia, they've been accused of being prostitutes, which is true because rumors get out that the mother's little shed where she has all these children is a brothel. And what happens is these 4 young men come to the brothel, and I'm going to spare you all the details, but there's a horrific sexual assault that takes place, a big investigation. These 4 guys that do it get lengthy prison terms in Canada. And so finally, the parents get back together and they move to Rochester, New York. And by this time, Lily and her younger sister, Katie, who's 2 years younger, have already had experience working as prostitutes. Katie's only 13 at the time. And in Rochester, this is a big Eastern industrial community, more than 100,000 people. And it's full of all kinds of temptations. It's got saloons and bordellos, gambling houses, you name it. And this is a very exciting place for Lily to be living in. So by the time she's 15, she's had multiple affairs. First one with a guy named Byers, who's 36 years old. He's employed as an architect. He eventually leaves and goes back to his home in Winnipeg, Canada, far to the west. Then she has affairs with other young men in their 20s. And at one point, she then has a domestic violence incident with one of her lovers. So she and her sister, Katie, dress like young boys. And again, this is a precursor to Pearl Hart wearing men's clothing, wearing a cowboy hat, a 6-shooter, and robbing a stagecoach. When you see her background, it starts to explain these things. So they want to avoid unnecessary sexual advances, so they dress like a couple of young hobos, steal a ride on a freight train. They get maybe 40 miles. They ended up getting picked up and sent back to Rochester. By this time, Katie then Pearl and Lily, aka Pearl, have many, many more misadventures in Rochester. They're picked up several times for street walking, for prostitution-related offenses. Lily marries a guy named Charles Dean. I think she's 16 at the time. He's in his mid-20s. He's a streetcar conductor by day. By night, he's a burglar, daring burglaries all over the Rochester area. Eventually, she decides to get out of Rochester. So again, she and Katie dress, cut their hair short. They steal their brother's clothing. Their brothers are also, I forgot to mention this, Henry and Willie Davey are both notorious burglars, sneak thieves, criminals. One of the things that the Davey children, all of them would do this, even in Canada, they would steal a cow, drive it into a village, sell it, then come back at night, steal it back, drive it to the next village, sell it again, and they do this until they get arrested. So they were very creative and fairly reckless young criminals. So this time, Katie and Lily jump on a train. They're dressed like boys. Their hair is cut. They make it all the way to Windham, Minnesota, and they get adopted more or less by a minister and a hotel keeper and his family. And they think that they're these young boys. And the problem is when they go to church, instead of goofing around and sticking pins in each other's backs like all the other boys are doing in the church, they're very religious. Well, they're pretending to be religious and they're behaving themselves, which makes the hotel keeper's 11-year-old son suspicious. So he walks into their room one night and the two girls are getting dressed or undressed for bed. And he blurts out, "You're both girls, I knew it." Well, this explodes the whole thing. They're arrested for cross-dressing. Almost every community in America had laws against cross-dressing back then. And there's a photograph taken, which I've been unable to find, but a wood engraving, thank goodness, was published in multiple newspapers showing the two girls in their boys' clothing. And so they end up getting sent back to the Erring Women's Institute. And that's not like Erring in an A-I-R, it's Erring, E-R-R-I-N-G, in Chicago. And this is for women that have been thieves or prostitutes or unwed mothers who have erred in their ways. And they're put in this big facility where they learn various skills. They learn childcare, they learn how knitting and other skills that they can learn, use to earn a living instead of going back to the streets. Well, Katie and Lily have no interest in any of this. So one night they get their bed sheets, tie them to a bed, make a rope out of them, skinny down the sheet, hit the streets and disappear. So the Chicago police are on the lookout for them. They end up eventually capturing the two. And the police chief of Chicago sends a wire to the police chief of Rochester, New York, saying, we'd like to send these two girls back. Who do we send them to? And the Rochester police chief wires back and says, keep them. Chicago is welcome to them. Well, eventually the charitable organization, which was the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty Not to Animals. This was the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, a major child protection agency in the United States back then. They get involved, they get the girls and get them sent back to their mother in Rochester, New York. And so this is just part of the many misadventures that Pearl Hart, AKA Lily Davy, has. She ends up in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, again dressed like a boy. This time a judge gives her 2 years in the Mercer Reformatory for young women. And she serves the time. There's no escaping. This is an actual prison in Canada. And she gets out in early 1890. And at this point, her beautiful sister, Katie, is only 17 years old, and she's running her own brothel in Buffalo, New York, upstairs from a saloon. And I always tell everybody, you know, this whole idea of women in saloons, saloon gals that dress in these low-cut dresses, and their job is to get the cowboys to buy drinks, and they dance with the cowboys. Well, this is because of the motion picture code back in 1933 or whatever, when they stopped being able to show what actually happened. There were no saloon girls or saloon gals in the Old West. They were prostitutes that worked upstairs from the bar. You'd come in downstairs, gamble and drink, and then go upstairs to see the prostitutes. So that's how they made a living. They didn't hang out in fancy clothes down in the bar. So Katie then is running her own brothel. She's a very tough young thing also. At one point, a guy causes a disturbance in the bar, in the brothel. Then he comes back and he's banging on the door. and he's looking in a little peephole that Katie had in the door window so she can tell if there's a police officer. She doesn't open the door, and she takes a knife and stabs the guy right in the eye through the peephole. And again, never gets prosecuted for it. I think the prosecutors probably thought the guy had it coming to him. So in Buffalo at that time, the most famous madam in town is a woman named Pearl Hart, who, like all these prostitutes in that era, some left the business, married, and lived happy lives. That's sort of like a rarer occasion. This Pearl Hart had a horrible life. And in the event, this is clearly where Lily Davy gets her alias, Pearl Hart. She eventually leaves after her siblings are all arrested, so she gets out of Buffalo and goes west to Toledo, Ohio. And here she meets a guy named Dan Bandman, who's actually from a very prominent family in New York. The father is a well-known mining engineer. He builds railroads, and he builds all kinds of mining railroads and mining tunnels and that kind of thing in South America. And Dan Bandman goes to a technical college to learn these skills, but he's not interested in it. He's a piano player, and he ends up leaving New York. He becomes a piano player in pool halls and bordellos, ends up in Toledo, Ohio, where she meets him. And this is what she likes. She likes fancy men who dress well, and he's very handsome, and he's a wonderful musician. And she later says, Lily says, we got married. It's probably a common law marriage, because there's no marriage record of anybody by their names or any by their aliases getting married in Toledo, Ohio. But he's just like her father. He's a drunk, even worse. He's addicted to morphine and opium. He gets her addicted to morphine and opium. He beats her, and she finally has a belly full, and she flees west and ends up in Tucson, Arizona. And at that point, the red light district of Tucson is called Block 41. It's just south of the downtown, today's downtown, and the historic downtown in, did I say Tucson? I mean Phoenix. She ends up in Phoenix. And Block 41 is the red light district of Phoenix. And then she ends up going back and forth from Block 41 in Phoenix to Gay Alley, which is the red light district in Tucson. And she becomes well known at both places. And she's known as Little Pearl because she's very petite. She's about 5'1", 105 pounds, something like that. Little Pearl is her nickname. And so there, she eventually, this is a very debilitating profession to have for anybody. And she doesn't like it, obviously. She doesn't like being addicted to morphine. So she ends up moving to Globe, Arizona, and she hooks up with a guy who calls himself Joe Boot. And no amount of research has ever led me to figure out his real name. And there were so many itinerant criminals in the Old West. We're lucky we know who any of them are, let alone somebody like Joe Boot. And Lily later says that she wanted money to go back home because her mother was dying. Well, that's not true. Her mother didn't die for another 12 years or so. But she clearly I think she wanted to go back to her family. And at this point, Katie has left her life as a prostitute. She's moved to Kansas City, Missouri, and she's become an actress and becomes fairly successful, at least in sort of these, second-rate theaters. And she's able to earn a good living. And Lily, they're plainly communicating by letter. And she knows that they're in Kansas City, and she wants to go back and live with her mother and her sisters. So how do we get the money? Rob a stagecoach. And so that's the story about how she ended up in Yuma prison. She remains very notable Writers and reporters come to visit her in prison. They take photographs of her in prison, which you can see in my book. According to one former convict, she helped organize a prison break. There's no primary source confirmation for that. That could just be an old wives' tale or an old convict's tale. So that is something that is falsely, I think, told about her. In Yuma, another famous story is that Billy Stiles, the famous Arizona train robber, his partner was Bert Alford. They robbed a number of trains, broke jail in Tombstone, very famous in that era, that they had an affair and he got her pregnant. Well, the problem is they weren't in prison at the same time. So she got pregnant through Billy Stiles. It was some kind of immaculate conception. So just a crazy story. It's been printed, I don't know how many times, but I have a whole chapter in the back of my book exploding all the myths and fables about Pearl Hart. And that's one of the best known. So the other one that's best, very well known, is that because of her pregnancy, the governor decided, we've got to get her out of there. This is a scandal. This is going to ruin me politically. So I'm going to give her a pardon. And again, that's not what happened. There's actually an outbreak of malaria in the prison. They were worried about some of the women dying, getting very sick from malaria. They just didn't really have a proper, the photograph of the women's quarters. It's basically like almost like a hole bored in the side of the ridge where Yuma is built on top of the banks of the Colorado River, and some of the prison is actually rooms blasted out into the rock walls next to the river, and that's essentially the women's quarters. They just don't have facilities for women, and they let some of the ones that were the lesser crimes, like stage robbery, the ones that did horrific murders, those women did not get pardons, but they pardoned out several of the women to make space and to try to put a stop to this outbreak of malaria in the women's quarters. So she does get out of prison. She ends up going back to her family in Kansas City, but that's not the end of it. She and Katie get into all kinds of trouble. They get mixed up. Katie opens up her own grocery store, which is in a neighborhood in Kansas City, which is still not the greatest neighborhood, up in northern part of Kansas City, Kansas, actually. And they become very well known. They're both arrested by the police, and which is by happenstance the way I managed to figure out their real names, because at one point their brother Henry Davey is arrested in Kansas City, and somehow a reporter learns that he's the brother of Pearl Hart. And they interview her. The reporters go and interview her, and she denies being Pearl Hart, and she clearly was. So in any event, she then has kind of a checkered life. She marries another guy in Kansas City. The marriage lasts, 6 months, something like that. Eventually, she marries a guy who calls himself Earl Lighthawk. His real name is Earl Myers, but he claims that he's Native American, and he picks up this Plains Indian name of Lighthawk and goes around the country selling these patent medicines. In the terminology of the era, he's a snake oil salesman, not dissimilar to some of the ones we see on television today. And so he then, they have a daughter, and he turns out to be pretty much of a flake also. She just can't find good men. He's very dishonest. They break up, they get back together, they break up. Finally, she ends up at one point in the 1900 census. They're actually back living in Phoenix with Earl Myers listed as the head of the household, Lily, and her daughter. And so the short version is she then leaves Earl Lighthawk. Finally, her daughter marries to a very reputable sailor who's a submariner in the 1920s. They end up settling in Los Angeles. She lives there as a grandmother, helping raise her granddaughters in what's now East Los Angeles. And she dies there in 1935, age 64. It's kind of surprising she lived that late given her drug addiction. She later said that getting locked up in Yuma was the best thing that ever happened to her because it forced her to kick the morphine and opium habit. And then her sister Katie goes on, she becomes a Hollywood screenwriter. She claims that she acted in silent films. She ends up also living in Los Angeles for many, many years and dies there in 1955. And the only people that knew their real identities were their siblings. And they covered it up for so many years until my book basically opened the door into the real life of Pearl Hart. So that's sort of the nutshell version of her life. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, John. I have a bunch of notes, and we'll take questions as we come in. I just really appreciate how much context you have provided with us, not only national context, but international context. I think that the story that most of us know about Pearl Hart is lacking a lot of that context. And it's really fascinating to think about in a time where mass transportation, particularly in the West, is just kind of burgeoning. How did she cover so much ground? And that's a rhetorical question. I don't think we could ever answer that. But how did she cover so much ground and be in so many of these different places? So I guess some of the first questions that I have for you is what, you had mentioned that you are kind of interested in law and order in the American West kind of generally, but what drew you to Hart and her story?
Well, I mentioned Bob Paul, the famous lawman of the California Gold Rush and of Tombstone and later all over Arizona. And he was her jailer for quite a few months. And he's the one that let all the reporters in. So in working on my biography of Bob Paul, it's called When Law Was in the Holster, published back in 2012. I did a lot of research on Pearl Hart, and I even had wrong information about Pearl Hart in that book. But it got me, my interest peaked, and I've always kind of wondered, I knew this wasn't her real name. Because most women that went into that lifestyle, because it was so scandalous back then, they changed their names to protect their families. And so that's what led me to doing the research into Pearl Hart. I had a couple other books come out in the interim, but I kept working on Pearl Hart. And then when I finally figured out who she was, that just opened the floodgates to tell the stories of her and her siblings.
Can you
and I
share?
was going to mention,
sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. One thing I forgot to mention. So the biggest misinformation in Arizona is that Pearl Bywater, who's buried in Globe and was married to a rancher south of Globe, about 10 or 12 miles from Cane Springs Canyon, where the robbery happened, that she's Pearl Hart. And the only thing she's got to do with Pearl Hart is her first name is Pearl. She has absolutely nothing to do with Pearl Hart. She was a respectable woman. She did get married to a cowboy early on, and they got divorced, which is a big enough scandal back then. She had nothing to do with Pearl Hart. And if you read the Wikipedia page on Pearl Hart, I tried to fix it. And these, people that just devoutly believe everything on Wikipedia, and I tell everybody, I don't know about politics or sports, but, probably 75% at least, it's getting better, but it used to be 50% of everything about outlaws and lawmen on Wikipedia is either wrong, partly wrong, or completely wrong. And so the Pearl Hart page on Wikipedia is just rank fiction. I tried to fix it and they removed all my corrections and they put a little thing at the bottom that I claim that my book is Pearl Hart. And so, that's the difference. I do primary source research. I've been doing it forever. And, my research ain't Wikipedia. Wikipedia is getting way better. It's getting a lot better, thank goodness, because there's devoted people that are now trying to make it good.
So I guess I have two kind of related but perhaps divergent paths. So maybe I'll ask both questions and then we'll see which one is more compelling. So one is, of course, to describe your research process as a primary source researcher. But I guess related to that is can you give us a sense of how you separate fact from fiction? We have these, especially in, I think, the West, we have these figures that are so mythologized, and their stories are kind of cut and recut for different media forms over the last 200 or so years. So details get added, details go missing. How do you separate the kind of fact from fiction while you're doing your research?
Well, it's very different. And if you look at difficult, and if you look at the other characters of the American West, you have politicians, you have labor leaders, you have women's rights activists. There's so many different aspects of political and social history, but they've not received the same attention as Wyatt Earp or Jesse James or Butch Cassidy. And what's happened is people remember those stories. They tell the old wives' tales. They come out, I see a kooky new photo of Billy the Kid, probably 2 a month. I just get so exhausted from trying to explain people, if you don't have any provenance, you don't have a historic photo. You can't find a photo of Billy the Kid in a local flea market, so it's very difficult. I do tell people nowadays research is so much easier. I'm more productive because I can find things online on Ancestry, on newspapers.com. In the old days, I'd have to spend days going through the newspaper microfilm. I'd basically get motion sickness from reading it. We'd all used to joke about getting car sick at the library, all my friends that do this kind of research. And so now you could do a lot of research online. But I also tell people, if you haven't had a close encounter with a rat in the basement of a courthouse in rural Texas or rural Arizona, you ain't doing proper research. Because at some point, you've got to get there. You've got to get into these primary source records. If you're fortunate enough to have a wonderful organization like the Arizona Historical Society, which I have owed you guys so many favors for 30, 40 years, just digging up stuff for me. And of course, I've spent days and days at your library doing the research, using your iconic green paper. That's, I don't know if you still require the green paper.
Oh yeah, the acid-free paper, absolutely.
Yes, and I can go on about how that happened. And a certain gentleman was stealing documents and ended up in Lompoc's federal penitentiary. It's a very well-known story in the collecting community. And thank goodness, most of that stuff that was stolen ended up back in the Arizona Historical Society. So you guys are protecting our heritage and preserving it, and I'm hugely grateful. And I know I got way off topic, but hopefully I answered the question a little bit.
Definitely. What would you say was the most surprising thing that you uncovered during the course of your research?
About Pearl Hart, probably, it wasn't surprising, but it was like, my goodness, she's dressing like a boy when she's 12 and 13 years old. And I actually have an image of her when she's 16 or 15 and Katie's 13 or 14, of both of them dressed in their brother's clothing with their hair cut short. And suddenly that explains, the background, so you put everything together. She learned how to use guns in Arizona. She always said she was a good shot. She hung out with rough characters. At one point, I didn't mention this in my talk, she and Billy Stiles, the famous outlaw lawman who became an outlaw, get arrested at the same time and booked at the same time in Phoenix. So they apparently were involved in some kind of altercation or something. It's not clear exactly what happened, but she knew guys like this. And so when you look at all these things, she's reckless, she's daring, she's adventurous, she dresses like a man, she knows how to use a gun, she knows how to ride a horse. You put it all together, and what do you come up with? A woman stage robber.
Absolutely. I think that is all the questions that I have. So maybe we'll pause for a second to see if any last minute ones come in. But John, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and sharing these chapters of Pearl's life with us. I know that, you know, like we've been talking, and we've been talking this whole kind of biography series, is that the mythology of some of these individuals can get ahead of us. And so returning to that primary source, returning to that research, and being open-minded to interesting connections with interesting people or interesting events is always going to be the way that you're actually going to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think it's important, you know, it's such a time-worn phrase, but if, you know, we forget history, we're condemned to repeat it, right? And I think the more we understand about our background and the things that I write about, sometimes they're not always easy to listen to. So when I mentioned some of the sexual assaults that happen in the story, there's way more detail, and there's a lot more of them in the book. But those are things that happened, and I write facts. I put everything in there, whatever I find, if it's germane to the story. And if there's things that some people find disturbing, that's part of our history. And so it's important that we have a fair and balanced view and presentation of what happened without any kind of censorship or anything like that.
Well, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to share this story with us. And if you're joining from home, like I mentioned earlier, this program is being recorded, so I hope to send you a copy of the recording by the middle of next week. And otherwise, I hope that everyone has a really fabulous rest of their afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.